Great. So hello, everyone, and hello, Dr. Johnson-Freese. Thank you so much for joining us today. For those who don't know, Dr. Johnson-Freese is a political scientist, a senior fellow with Women in International Security, university professor of National Security Affairs at the Naval War College from 2002 to 2022, now Professor Emeritus with specializations in women, peace and security, space security, leadership, and professional military education. She's also the author of multiple nonfiction books and articles, a featured speaker at numerous national and international events, adjunct government department faculty here at the Harvard Extension and Summer Schools, teaching courses on women, peace, and security, grand strategy, and U.S. national security, and leadership in war and peace. Like I said, thank you so much for joining us, Dr. Johnson-Freese. So you came to us because, or we found you, because a previous HESA board member is currently taking your Women, Peace, and Security class. So I was wondering if you could just explain the course a little bit for us, what the content is and how it works.
I'd be happy to, and thank you for everyone who's joining us. I see some friendly faces, and I highly recommend, if you really want to know what the course is about, ask the people who are in it or have taken it, Joe and Jennifer and Diana, because they can probably tell you, give you the student's perspective. But from my perspective, from the faculty perspective, I appreciate the opportunity to talk to you about the course because there's a lot of misunderstanding and misinformation and assumptions made about the course that I would like to correct. It is a government course. It's a security related course as much as a class in national strategy, grand strategy, nuclear weapons, globalization. It is not a gender studies course or a social justice course. The class looks at gender equality and gender inequality in relation to national and international security. And we do that from a very empirical, data-based perspective. It's been shown through decades of longitudinal data that the higher a country is in gender inequality, the more likely it is to be corrupt, unstable, authoritarian, and other attributes which do not bode well for either development or stability, or what we call positive peace which will endure over the long run. So the course is called Women, Peace, and Security, based on UN Security Council Resolution 1325, passed in the year 2000, which set forth a framework that talked about, again, gender inequality and how to abate that, how to kind of correct that. And it's through 4 pillars, and those are increased women's participation, women and minorities' participation in security-related affairs. And if you remember nothing else from this little talk tonight, remember that there is no such thing as women's issues. All issues are women's issues and men's issues. Family care, we certainly learned during COVID that childcare is not a woman's issue, it's a family issue. So participation, prevention, using indicators of gender inequality to identify where there's going to be instability and try and abate it. Relief and recovery, the idea that when crises happen, you have to rebuild, and you can rebuild better. You don't have to rely on the same kind of old patriarchal systems that were ineffective. But when you kind of boil down the 4 pillars, what it comes down to is inclusive diversity. Women not just having a seat at the table, but a voice at the table, being valued participants. And something called gendered perspectives. And gendered perspectives means recognizing that policies and programs have different effects on men, women, boys, and girls. And the example that I often give to point that out, 2 examples. One is that more women than men die in car crashes. And it's not because women are worse drivers, regardless of the myth. It's because the crash dummies that are used to set safety standards are built to a male body type, not a female. So it's built to a 6', 200-pound body, which those safety standards don't work for a 5'2", 120-pound woman. So it's understanding that these policies and programs work differently. And inclusive diversity. Again, this idea that not just a place at the table, but a voice that is appreciated at the table. So in the class, we look at various aspects of impacts of gender equality on development, on gender-based violence, on the role that women play in conflicts, in ending conflicts, in different policy sectors. So the course, kind of to sum it up, is very much about security. It's very much a political science course. And I like to say it's of value to students interested in everything from international relations to security affairs, to social justice, to international law, and beyond, and to practitioners. I often have a lot of practitioners in the class, and they add so much. We have had lots of military people in the class, and we've had a former CNN anchor. We have had people who work in nonprofits. We've had a lot of government workers, government officials in the class. So it's a broad-based class looking at the relationship between gender and security.
Thank you so much. And I think I have an idea based on what you said, but from the title of the course, a couple of people asked, oh, is this a course designed specifically for women? So I wanted to ask, do you think that this is a course that is primarily of interest to women, or does it have broader appeal?
Much broader appeal. I'm so glad that we can really focus on that. Interestingly enough, and Joe's here, he can maybe testify, it's often the men who come away from the class saying, I'm so glad I took this. I'm so glad I didn't let the title keep me from signing up. Because it is, again, Women, Peace, and Security is the name of the Security Council resolution, but it's about men, women, boys, and girls. If I may, I'll tell just a little anecdote. I had a male military member, an Army captain in the class, and he's an intelligence officer. And at the end of the class, I said, does anybody have any comments or questions? And he raised his hand. He said, I do. I'm angry. And I said, at me? And he said, no, I'm angry that as a military intelligence officer, I have taken every course available to me on intelligence, and nobody has ever mentioned gender before. And I feel like I've been not really giving the people who use my intelligence assessments as much information and as complete information as I might have had I known this. So I would argue that I would love to see more men in the class. I would love to see them overcome the title. We've discussed many times potentially changing the title, but I think it's important that that individuals do recognize that this does tie back to a UN initiative, which has been accepted by over 150 countries through actions and programs. And I might add, the United States, in the United States, we have a Women, Peace, and Security Act, which legislatively mandates implementation of the Women, Peace, and Security principles through 4 agencies: the Defense Department, the State Department, USAID, and the Department of Homeland Security. So you can tell by those 4 organizations that this is very much a security framework or initiative, not a social justice initiative.
Thank you. And thank you for clarifying that, because I know that that's something that a lot of people are wondering. So from your resume, which I mentioned briefly at the beginning, you have a very rich academic background teaching security studies courses at the Naval War College at Harvard, and doing research and writing on space security issues, which I would love to have another session to talk just about that. But can you tell me what shifted your focus to women, peace, and security?
Yeah. it's now been about 14 or 15 years ago. I will say I was teaching at the Naval War College and at Harvard, and I was teaching things like grand strategy, space security. I was testifying before Congress about the Chinese space program. And a colleague of mine invited me to go to a Women, Peace, and Security conference. And I very arrogantly thought, I'm a woman who's taught security studies for 20 plus years. What could I possibly learn? And I said, no, thank you. I'm busy. And the next year, I'm very appreciative that she asked me again. And I thought, well, for professional courtesy, I'll go. And I went to a 2-day conference and listened to this rich material and immediately began refocusing my own career. I immediately became an advocate and made it kind of my purpose to spread the word, because unfortunately, there are far too many practitioners and students who have never heard about women, peace, and security, who have never thought about the relationship between gender and national security. And frankly, I think that's a big hole in education and in practitioner knowledge. So I began being an advocate. I started teaching at Harvard. Well, I've been teaching at Harvard since 2004, but I started developing a course for Harvard and very soon found that there was no introductory book. There were lots of really rich writings about different aspects of women, peace, and security, but nothing for an individual who just wanted a broad knowledge, who wanted an introduction. And so I wrote that, and we're now using the second edition of that book. And the book gets better with every edition because of the students, because of people like Joe, because of people like Diana and Jen, who add to my knowledge. I certainly don't know everything, but the examples that they bring really enrich the discussions in class and the things that I write about.
That's fantastic. And you did mention, I think at the beginning, that you have a quote from one of your students, Joe, I think it was, in your latest book. So that's very cool to hear. One thing you mentioned, you said that there are a lot of people who have never thought about the relationship between gender and security. I have to ask, what about those who have thought about it but are skeptical as to its importance and what, how important the role of gender is in security?
That's a great question. And the skeptics sometimes outnumber the believers. It's interesting. I speak all over the world on this topic, and it doesn't matter if I'm at the Pentagon or if I'm in Ethiopia or if I'm in Toledo, Ohio, and I've spoken on it in all three of those. No matter how big the audience is, I always begin by saying, how many people in the room feel they are conversant in women, peace, and security? And regardless of the audience, regardless of the size, it is never more than 10%. So those who are aware, it's a very small number. And among those who are aware, there's a pretty high percentage of skeptics. So how do I respond to that? Data, data, data. It is difficult to refute the data. There's a woman who heads a multidisciplinary team at Texas A&M, Valerie Hudson, who I'm proud to say is a colleague and friend, and she and her team have received a grant actually from the U.S. military to run data, large data banks, to look at the relationship between gender and international security. And in every category that they've run, they have found a correlation. So I addressed the skeptics with data, and it was very interesting. Last fall, I was giving a talk to a large group of U.S. Special Forces, and it was mostly 70% men, 30% women. And I began with the data. I just used 2 slides of data. And at the end of the talk, a man came up and he said, I'm heading up a SEAL team, and you had me at those slides. I started paying attention. Once you see the relationship between gender and security, you can't unsee it. And the data gets you to that point where you recognize it's there. And I think, again, those who have taken the class will agree with me. Once you see it everywhere.
One other thing you mentioned earlier that I wanted to ask about, you said that it's important that women don't just have a seat at the table, but a voice at the table. And I was wondering if you could just elucidate the distinction there that you're making.
Yeah. Organizations, bureaucracies are very good at complicity. Oh, they will comply with anything you put in front of them. But too often it's through box checks. We are all familiar with the box check syndrome. And with efforts of diversity, a lot of times organizations will hire a woman. There, box checked. But what a lot of research has found, and it's interesting, whenever I talk to audiences, I assume there's a lot of skeptics. So I start with research has found and talk only from data points. But research has found that until the minority population in an organization reaches 25 or 30%, there will be considerable hesitation for an individual to voice an opinion without fear of retribution, without fear of someone coming back at them. Well, what I get all the time is, well, Joan, that's just your opinion, which is why I then use data, data, data. No, it's not just my opinion. Research has shown. So I think it's important that we recognize there is this tipping point at about somewhere between 20 and 30%, where until you reach that level, where women can begin to support each other, and men as allies. I'd love to have Joe in a meeting with me. I know he'd be my ally. Will help each other. And what that means is, I'm sure that women who are listening have been in a situation where they say something and it's ignored. And then a man says it and it's the best idea since sliced bread. Well, if there's more than one woman, or if there is an ally, a male ally in the room, they could stop things and say, Danielle's idea was really good. Can we go back to that for a minute? And help each other be noticed, be acknowledged. So it's this idea of, does the woman have actually a voice that is appreciated, or is she just sitting at the table to check a box?
Interesting. And so Twitter, a few years ago, before it was taken over, coined a term for that. There was a woman on Twitter and she called it he peated. So it's when a man has repeated the same idea that a woman has said, but all of a sudden now it's, oh, yes.
Well, there's a whole series of things called microaggressions that women in minorities often experience. And it's the little things. I've been in many rooms where people are introduced as Dr. Smith, Dr. Jones, and Joan. Well, I'm a doctor too. Interrupting. Women Supreme Court justices are interrupted more than men by lawyers. There's an expression called manels, where it's a panel on what women can add to security, and it's all men. I would think a woman would be appropriate on that panel. There are a whole series of these. And by the way, these microaggressions are very wearing on women. They're exhausting. And they really wear on women's confidence. What happens is you just start to go quiet. And that means you don't have a voice into what's actually going on. And that inclusive diversity is lost.
Yeah, that's, I'd not heard manels before, but that's great. I'm going to save that for future use because unfortunately, I'm sure it'll come up again. One thing that's come up for me, so I was in an executive leadership position and I was part of an executive group locally. And when I left, I was very concerned because at the time there were only 3 women in this entire group of people, and they were looking for a replacement. And I said, I think it's important that you look for another woman. And it was like, well, we'll have to see what candidates we get. And it's a lot of, oh, this is somebody that I play golf with, so I'm going to introduce them into the group. So I'm curious, and forgive me for putting you on the spot here, but do you have any advice for that type of attitude when clearly the data shows that having women at the table and having a voice at the table is something that makes such a significant difference? How do we get those women to the table?
That's a great question. I wish I had the answer. What we can do is, again, try to educate people as to the real benefits. People do things because it benefits them. You know, sadly, we're all about furthering ourselves and our organization. And we do have data that diversity increases both decision making and innovation. And that data holds true not just in academia or in corporations, but in the military as well. Which is why, again, I just spend as much time as I can on soapboxes trying to show people this data so that they will realize it's a benefit to them. And what you really have to do is convince them that you can give them someone who is going to be better for them and better for the organization than their golf buddy. And that's a tough job. You know, it's really tough. And it's tough for the person you put in there because they're going to feel like they're tilting at windmills. I tell this story in class, and I'll take the opportunity to do it now. When I worked in space security, I worked with a lot of women astronauts. They're astronauts. I think we can assume they are competent. They are top of the line competent. But in a panel of 4 astronauts, South Korean, Chinese, US, and Canadian, somebody in the audience asked the question, what is the hardest part of being a woman astronaut? And the Canadian raised her hand, Julie Payette, and she said, oh, let me answer that. And her answer was, the hardest part of being an astronaut, a female astronaut, is having to prove my competence to my male colleagues over and over every single day. So we want to get these women in, and they want to go, but let's not underestimate the difficulty and the persistence that many women have put forth in order to be in these positions.
Yeah, that is such a great point, and I think something that doesn't get enough thought and consideration is that, in like you said earlier, it's exhausting. It really is. Um, so I do want to hear a little bit more about what you're working on now, but before we do that, I just wanted to check and see if anyone in the audience, our live audience, that is, had any questions that they'd like to ask.
I see a hand.
Jen. Yeah.
Hi, yes, ma'am. It's good seeing you again. I took your national security and globalization course for my master's over at Harvard during summer school. Since then, I moved on to DoD, joined the intelligence community, and I'm currently working on my master's at Penn. And I'm writing about Sweden and joining NATO and national security. And I haven't thought about gender at all. And this popped up on my Facebook feed, and I was like, I got to ask her, what do you think the implications are? What is your opinion on how gender and security is going to play a role with Sweden? And I apologize if that's specific, but anything you've got to point me in the right direction would be great.
Well, Sweden has, in fact, as I'm sure you're acutely aware, you know, in all the polls that look at gender equality, Sweden, Denmark, Norway, they're all at the top. They have a social belief in gender equality, but that doesn't mean that they don't have gender-related issues. In fact, there's something called the Nordic paradox, that even in these countries with high social equality rankings, there's high levels of things like domestic violence. But when it comes to security, even though they are high on the rankings of gender equality, there's still a lot of gender stereotyping. Getting women into the military in the Nordic countries hasn't been as easy as might have been expected, but they've done some really groundbreaking gender-related security studies work. There are some of the courses that are taught to gender advisors are out of Scandinavia. some of the research on things like mixing bunks, male and women, females and males in bunks has been done in the Nordic countries. So I think what you would find from Scandinavia, from Sweden joining NATO, is a push to further implementation of women, peace, and security. They've also been very active in pushing women, peace, and security principles in developing countries. And they have a lot of knowledge and expertise that would be added through that. So I would love to see Sweden join for this gender awareness and experience that they would bring.
That's fantastic. Thank you very much. I appreciate
Sure.
that very much.
Ramona, go ahead.
Hi, I'm Ramona. I apologize. I showed up a little late, so I apologize if this is a little bit off topic, but it's just something that I thought of, that the security that protects our president, have we ever had a female in any of those roles? The Secret Service?
Yeah, that's a great question. It's very interesting in that there's a lot of articles in the newspapers and the media today, excuse me, blaming women in Secret Service for the assassination attempt. That if it were all men, he would have been perfectly protected. But because there are women, we have sacrificed security for diversity. And of course, that's nonsensical, but it goes along with blaming patriarchal organizations and movements and people, just blaming women. And it happens all the time. When the freighter got stuck on the Suez Canal, they blamed a woman captain who wasn't even on board. I mean, it's always blame a woman. But yes, there are women in the Secret Service, and they have been very effective, highly effective in guarding both men and women. They meet all the same physical training standards, and they are actually in some instances thought to be more effective because they hear different types of information than the men do. It's like women in intelligence have access to information from other women that sometimes the men just don't get. So yes, women are in Secret Service.
That actually raises another question that I thought of, which is, so this class is under the government umbrella, but the things that you're saying and talking about as somebody who's not studying government sound pretty universally applicable. So I'm just curious, would you say that the class is geared primarily for those in the government field, or beyond that?
It is much broader than that. It's like looking at economics or globalization. That has such broad implications. The class I'm teaching has implications from psychology, sociology, urban planning, security, social justice, law. It is a very broad-based course. And it is broad-based in its aspects, but we look at all those different aspects, gender empowerment, gender equality, towards a goal of stability, government stability.
Okay. And even you mentioned, I think you didn't say it by name, but I think there might even be opportunities for data science majors considering building that research. And
it's interesting too. I'm very proud of students who have taken the course and followed through with it in different ways. I always show in class some of the efforts that are done. I had a student from France who is an artist, and she's done some absolutely beautiful pastels that she now distributes to raise awareness about gender-based violence issues. I have a man took the course from Alabama, a construction owner, construction company owner, and he now supports a foundation in Uganda for acid throwing survivors. I mean, the breadth is endless. I even had, by the way, the editor of Vogue Brazil took the class, started an organization called Free, which now has a chapter at Harvard, and it's crazy in the fashion industry. So there you go.
That's incredible. Vogue Brazil, that's so specific. uh, and I'm so sorry, did we have any other questions from the audience? Because I kind of butted in there. Second. We do have a question in the chat, which is, do you think that there has been any market for paid consultants or coaches in the United States to improve gender equality / equity in security, or has there mostly been an expectation of volunteer work in this area? If so, would the educational background people desire to provide these services be more in the DEI, industrial organizational psychology, international relations, or some other field?
So to clarify first, DEI is through human resources. Women, peace, and security is through operational planning of whatever you're doing. So they are connected, but they are not the same. In the military, there are special positions called gender advisors and gender focal points who act as consultants to commanding officers. In the private sector, there are consultants on WPS per se, but there are lots of individuals who are working on it from, for example, through aid programs, development programs, through gender-based violence programs. So again, because of the breadth of material, there are specialists in different fields, lots of specialists in different fields, including consultants. But I don't really know of a women, peace, and security consultant in the private sector, lots in the government sector. What I would point out is there's an organization you mentioned at the beginning. I am a senior fellow at an organization called Women in International Security. They have the best jobs board for this field that I know of. There's also an organization at Harvard Kennedy School, W3D or 3WD, Women in Development, Defense, and Diplomacy. There are programs there's one called Our Secure Future, which is a nonprofit that, again, kind of gathers up individuals who are interested in the topic, men and women. And I emphasize, again, men are key to making this happen. When I talk, I have a vested interest in success. When Joe talks, when Jeff talks, it carries a lot more weight.
Thank you. And I will get links from you for the jobs board to include when we distribute the video for this. Since I'm not seeing any other questions, I was hoping you might share a little bit. You mentioned that you had written a book, an introductory primer on women, peace, and security. But what are you working on now, if you would be willing to share?
Absolutely, because the book's coming out in June. I'm writing a book called Leadership in War and Peace, Masculine and Feminine. And it is a book, what I keep finding every time I talk about this issue, like in class, it comes down to leadership. Whether or not you integrate it into organizations comes down to, does the leadership believe in gender equality? Does the leadership understand the relationship between gender equality and security? So this book, Leadership on War and Peace, talks about military leaders, political leaders, foreign service officers, anyone who works in war and peace issues, and how leadership needs to combine both masculine and feminine traits to be effective in the future. that in fact, we find in a lot, studies have found that, for example, men are very confident. Men are much more confident than women. Women are very prudent. And prudence doesn't mean risk averse. Prudence means goal oriented and able to kind of recognize impediments to reaching your goal, including ego. And ego goes with confidence a lot. So it's this idea that if you recognize and utilize both masculine and feminine traits in leadership, you will be a much more effective leader in the future. And it talks about, for example, that there are two different versions of gender equality. One, which was very popular in the 1970s, is gender equality means everybody's the same. Everybody's the same. We are interchangeable parts. And that is used a lot for box checking and compliance. Oh, let's see, Danielle left, we can plug in a man and it doesn't matter. The other more evolved version is that men and women are absolutely different. Physiologically, they are motivated different, they communicate differently, hear differently, but they can complement each other. These differences can, in fact, what it's called gender value. They are value added principles. And talking about, I use examples from the military. For example, there were women who served with special forces teams in Afghanistan. They were members of what's called cultural support teams. And they would go with the special forces on night missions. They did the same things physically as the men. They were trained, they were fully prepared. But when they would go into villages, their job was to talk to the women and children, because the men in the service, in the United States services, military, were not allowed to talk to the women. So these women would go and talk to other women and children, and the women in the villages knew things and told them things. So, for example, one woman told me that when she would go into the villages, she would stuff her pockets with beanie babies. And one night she was in a village and she saw this little boy who was clearly very afraid. And she went over to talk to him and she gave him a beanie baby. And a few minutes later, he came over and he took her hand and led her over to where they were hiding a big cache of guns. So they achieved their mission through total non-aggression. It's this idea of, again, for men, threats are usually responded to by fight or flight. For women, women tend to look for non-aggressive kind of options like tend and befriend, it's called, to try and find ways to deal with things without aggression. And if you combine them, one's not better than the other, but if you combine them, it expands your options for conflict management. It expands your non-aggressive options. So this book that I'm writing now encourages leaders it encourages diverse leadership, and for individuals to recognize that you don't have to be always aggressive, and that sometimes it's good to be aggressive, and that for women, you need to be able to recognize when somebody it's good to be empathetic and when you need to be tough. I had a woman military officer tell me that she got to a base and somebody said, "Oh, we're so glad you're here so that we have a compassionate leader." And she said she thought to herself, why do you assume that about me? You don't know anything about me. So it's trying to get over assumptions that are sometimes very wrong, and not useful. So the book, I'm almost done. It will go to my editor for production October 1st, and it will be out June 1st. And I'm very much hoping that not this academic year, but next academic year, I'll be able to teach a course and use the book as part of the course.
Oh, that's very cool. That sounds really, again, like it has much broader implications, just being able to combine those different styles. So Leadership on War and Peace will be coming out then next June. And do you have any other books that you'd like to share, mention? I know there are a few here. I'm not sure which ones to mention.
The other one that I will mention, when I wrote the first edition of Women, Peace, and Security, one of the things that really surprised me was just how much women are put in competition with each other. We are taught from a very early age to be in competition. And I did a large survey as part of the book research. And of course, traditionally, women are taught to compete for a husband. Gender stereotypical roles are the man is the protector and the provider, and the woman is the caregiver and childbearer. And, if you watch the Bridgertons, if you watch the Gilded Age, if you watch Game of Thrones or House of Dragons, the women are trying to marry well. That's your goal in life, marry well. Well, I hate to tell you, but we are still living with the hangover of that. The 650 women that I surveyed as part of the book research, the number one area where they said they would compete with each other was for a partner, for a male partner. And then right under that was for professional positions, because again, women know there's one position for a woman, maybe two, but that's it. You're in competition with men and with the other women. So I wrote a book called Women versus Women, the Case for Cooperation, which makes the case to women that we need to get much better at working together. Men are very good at alliances. They don't go into a room and say, do you agree with everything I do or I won't vote with you? They go in and make an alliance based on achieving their goal. And we aren't doing that. And it's especially true today in this very polarized political environment. And it usually breaks down over reproductive rights, that women who are for reproductive rights don't want to work with women who are against reproductive rights and vice versa. And because we don't agree on that doesn't mean we shouldn't be working together on things like gender-based violence. So that was the kind of in-between book from the first edition of Women, Peace, and Security and the second edition. And it has sparked a lot of discussions in book clubs and in kind of non-academic venues.
Excellent. That sounds fascinating. And I have to wonder, you mentioned limited seats at the table. So has that in some ways cultivated a sort of competition that might not otherwise exist or need to exist because of knowing that there's that limited space?
Yep, absolutely.
Interesting. Well, thank you so much. I don't know, did you have any other closing thoughts before we wrap up?
I would just ask all of you who are listening now, if you thought the material was interesting, tell a friend, tell them to come and listen, because we would love to have you in class this fall. I am going to teach it in the fall, not in the spring. And then again, the following year, I hope to be teaching the Leadership in War and Peace class. So there might not be another opportunity for another 24 months, 18 to 24 months. So we would love to have you. I think it'd be great if I can put Joe or Diana or Jen on the spot for just, one of you to say something about what surprised you taking the course, what surprised you about the material.
I'll go if you don't mind. I wanted to be here once I saw that the spotlight was going to be for you, because in taking the course, I knew I was going to learn something. I had no idea how much I was going to learn. I kind of assumed going into it that being a minority, that I could kind of relate, for lack of a better term, and that I would kind of know a lot of the issues and understand a lot of the issues pertaining to women, peace, and security. And the further along in the course I went, I continued to realize how much I didn't know. I didn't know what I didn't know. And it was eye-opening. And what I thought one thing I noticed about the class is not just eye-opening for me, the women in the class didn't know what they didn't know. So it's not about as Dr. Johnson-Freese said, it's not a women's rights course and all women are already going to know this material going into the course or whatever. There's a lot of information pertaining to security, and a lot of it that I realized as a military leader before I retired, things that I did to not make decisions on a full range of information from everyone under my charge. And I'm glad that I took it so that I learned this and I can apply it in my current, field of work. And I just hope that other people take it, especially men who think this is a women's rights course. And I feel kind of ashamed as a male that men would not want to take a women's rights course, first of all, but this is not a women's rights course. This is a course about security. This is a course about how women affect the safety of nations, of organizations. One example I look back on is the auto workers strike. The big auto worker strikes back in the 70s, and how without the women involved in those strikes, that things could have gone way horribly worse than I'm bad English. Sorry, I'm on the spot. But yeah, things could have gone so much worse than they did. And without the women involved, the change wouldn't have come. So that's what it's about. It's about the fact that women should have a voice at the table. And one thing I also got from the course was that we need to create an environment of belonging for everyone, not just women, not just men, whatever the minority group may be, and an environment where people feel free to speak and feel as though they're not going to be chastised for what they say and that their ideas are valued. And that's I think the biggest takeaway I got from this course, is that everyone needs a seat at the table and everyone's ideas need to be valued. Otherwise, we're not going to have the best solution possible for any situation.
See,
Thank you so much, Joe. Yeah, thank you so much for being on the spot, especially. That was really enlightening. So thank you. And I agree. I think one of the biggest takeaways I'm having just from tonight is that idea of 25 to 30% of that minority group needing to be present before they're comfortable speaking up. And I can very much I feel that very viscerally. So yeah, and it was surprising, but then not as soon as I sort of absorbed the information. So Jen, did you want to say anything?
Yes. So when I first joined this course, I was expecting it to be sort of like a social justice course for women, but never could I imagine how vital women could be to the security of nations, and how our networks can literally save entire nations depending on where they are in the world and what we need. But I honestly believe that all of us really need to be taking this course, because the security of our nation right now depends on it. And just the agency of women can pretty much decide whether or not we, in the end, are a free nation.
Thank you, Jen. And Diana, you're up next. Oh,
Hi,
Diana, and then Jeff.
Oh, sorry. I've really enjoyed taking this course so far. I also did not understand just what a big and all-encompassing issue it was, and just how it's not a gender studies course. It is definitely a security course. And I've learned so much, even as a woman, just about the ways that a woman's agency is impacted in different situations, and just what a difference it can make to security, to lives, to community, just to everything, for women to have a seat at the table, and not only a seat, but a voice. I've also found it very inspirational for myself in my own life, and things that I, want to accomplish going forward, in spaces that I would like to get into as a woman. The other really, really wonderful part of the course is we also have absolutely amazing guest speakers that are truly inspirational as well. So highly recommend the course. You will learn a lot about security, about agency, and honestly, I've learned a lot about myself so far. So I'm very excited and thankful for the course.
That's great to hear. Thanks, Diana. And Jeff, I saw you waved your live
Yeah, I
hand.
just wanted to really briefly say I took her class as an elective, the globalization one. I was an anthro guy, and I was like, maybe I'll take a national security class, and it shifted an entire career focus for me. I mean, I ended up joining the intelligence community. So you never know, taking a class like this, I think, can open doors that maybe you don't even know are opening until years later. So I just want to put that pitch in there that class really helped me. It was a different course, but same instructor, and she did an awesome job, and highly recommend taking the class, even if it's not what you're going to focus on. You never know how it's going to impact you. So I just wanted to throw that out.
Thank you so much, Jeff. Dr. Johnson-Freese, one more question. You, before I let you go, you mentioned that you'll be teaching the Women, Peace, and Security in the fall. Are you teaching anything else in the spring, or are you going to be focusing on your book?
I am only teaching in the fall and the spring. I have a lot of travel planned, quite frankly. I'm going to be doing some research. I'm going to be going to Kenya for an organization I work with, Solar Sisters, that we talk about in class. I'm going to London. I'm doing a lot of travel.
Excellent. That sounds great. I just wanted to make sure I didn't miss the opportunity if you had another class to mention it.
I will mention that I'm on LinkedIn, and whenever I publish anything, I always put it up on LinkedIn. So if you're interested in my publications, because I have quite a few in this area, you can find them there.
Great. And if you're okay with it, I'll include a link to your LinkedIn profile as well when we distribute this.
Yeah.
Great. Dr. Johnson-Freese, I have to say thank you genuinely, sincerely, so much for taking the time. I know you're probably extremely busy, and just really appreciate you giving us this time. And I've just learned so much just in this last hour that I would strongly encourage everyone to take your class. Absolutely. So thank you, really. And thank you, everyone, for coming.
Thank you. It was a pleasure, and I hope to see all of you in class.
Professor, it was absolutely